So thank you very much for this opportunity to present in this seminar. I hope you'll find this text or article rewarding. And I'm really very much looking forward to hearing your response as well from your perspective. So the background, one could say, is that this is meant or thought of as a chapter in a book. The rejection of final causation is often pointed out as one of the salient features of early modern philosophy. Oh, by the way, what I'll do is I'll do a talk for around 40 minutes, and after 2 or 3 minutes in talk, I'll start to kind of follow the structure of the article. So it'll be a kind of summary of the article, so you can follow it through the article, and I point to certain quotations and so on. But now I just give some background to the article first, and then come to the article itself. So the rejection of final causation is often pointed out as one of the salient features of what's called early modern philosophy in the 17th century. However, the history of this concept of final causation hasn't actually been traced from around the mid-14th century and up until late 16th century. So we have studies on the notion of final causation and so on in Buridan, who wrote in the mid-14th century. And we also have studies of the notion of final causation in Suarez' Metaphysical Disputations that came in 1597. Among other, my own dissertation, but there are a lot of studies on that. But between those years, or in philosophy between those dates, there actually aren't any studies done. So that's the reason why I want to write this book on final causation between these dates, because I would like to read one. So I'll have to write it in that case. So I do that within this project, Mechanization of Philosophy, 1300 to 1700, that's funded by the Swedish Research Council. And I do that together then with Henrik Åkerlund, who's professor at Stockholm University, and we have a postdoc also, Sylvain Rodot, for this 3-year project. However, then, when treating final causation in the late Middle Ages, it's sometimes hard to see and spell out the position that the author is taking. This has to do, among other things, with these authors trying to show that their position is actually the position of all thinkers that have been thinking about this up until their own time. And they also then work within a similar conceptual framework. You have this Aristotelian, broadly speaking, Aristotelian conceptual framework that they work within. So it's hard to really spell out how they differ and what position they're actually taking. So this chapter then is thought of as a background, a kind of heuristic tool to spell out the differences among late medieval thinkers on this particular topic or issue. So what I'm trying to do is not to actually spell out in every detail the positions of these 3 thinkers that I treat here, Aristotle, Buridan, and Averroes, because they're not part of the time frame that I'm actually interested in, but rather to give this background and to just paint their understanding of final causation more broadly. However, it has to be accurate, of course. So I'm very interested if you have any objections to my readings, of course. But I'm also interested in not just in the historical, whether the historical reconstructions here are correct, but also I'm also very interested to hear more systematic reflections regarding final causation from a more contemporary metaphysical perspective, and what you have to say from that. So don't feel like constrained from it being directed toward kind of the history of philosophy or reconstruction. I'm very much interested in this. I mean, that's why we do history of philosophy, right? We're interested in philosophical questions at bottom. So I'm very interested to hear about that as well. So to the article then. The heuristic scheme that I propose is kind of four-fielder, where one of the fields is empty. So I present that on page 2, and also with a graphical representation then of this four-fielder on page 20. This four-fielder is the result of the combination of two different understandings of final causation with regard to intentionality on the one hand, and on the other hand, two different conceptions of metaphysics in general, and change in particular on the other. So when it comes to the conception of finality, I make the distinction between, on the one hand, an intentionalist, and on the other, a non-intentionalist conception of finality. And with respect to metaphysics, then, I make this distinction between what I called a dynamic on the one hand and a boolean on the other, metaphysics. Boolean as a boolean variable that can only take the values 0 and 1. So it's either or, either something is or it isn't. And what I want to argue then is that we have three different kind of cases or combinations of these views with these three thinkers. In Aristotle, we have a non-intentionalist understanding of finality combined with a dynamic metaphysics. In Buridan, we have an intentionalist understanding of finality combined with a Boolean metaphysics. And in Averroes, we have an intentionalist understanding of finality combined with a dynamic metaphysics. So this will then be argued under the respective subchapters. So let's start with the first one, Aristotle, starting on page 3. So let's start in Aristotle's Physics to understand the part that finality then, telos or Latin finis, plays in Aristotle's thinking. In his Physics, the end comes in when Aristotle treats causes. He writes in the Physics, and this is on page 3, the quotation that belongs to note number 6. So I'll just say page 3, note 6, and then it says which quotation it is. Quote, knowledge is the object of inquiry, and men do not think they know a thing till they have grasped the why of it, which is to grasp its primary cause. So clearly, we too must do this as regards both coming to be and passing away, and every kind of natural change, in order that, knowing their principles, we may try to refer to these principles each of our problems, end quote. So in the Physics, causes have to do with the explanation of change, metabole in Greek. They can also be called becauses. You can see here note 7 on page 3 on where I treat the question of how to render the word aitia then in English. Aitia as usually translated then as cause, of course, but that can be misleading. Now, one explanation here does not need to exclude another. And so we can understand the question why in many different ways. And Aristotle makes a famous division then into 4 main ways, so to say, to understand this question. He groups them into 4 different ways to understand it. On the other hand, the different ways of understanding the why question might end us up in the same explanation as is the case with self-movers, the paradigmatic case for Aristotle, where the form or the soul can be seen as both the formal and efficient as well as the final cause. So to say that there are 4 different kinds of causes doesn't mean that there are like 4 things in each case that are the causes, but they can lead to the same thing, let's say ontologically, these 4 questions, which is then the case in the most basic case, namely organisms. So we have started in the area of physics then, in the world of change, but this does not mean that this is a self-contained area for Aristotle. On the contrary, the study of the changeable leads us to the unchangeable. As Aristotle writes, and this is still in the physics, not in the metaphysics, in the physics, and this is on page 6, note 15 in the article. Quote, now the principles which cause motion in a natural way are two, of which one is not natural, as it has no principle of motion in itself. Of this kind is whatever causes movement, not being itself moved, such as that which is completely unchangeable, the primary reality, and the essence of a thing, that is, the form. For this is the end for the sake of which. Hence, since nature is for the sake of something, we must know this cause also, end quote. So I won't try to account for this very interesting quotation fully, but it suffices here to say that one can see here that in the explanation of change, we're also led to the unchangeable. So they're not like exclusive areas of investigation for Aristotle. So this is once again then an example of Aristotle's causal pluralism, one can say. Not only does he enumerate 4 different basic ways to understand the question why, but the cause of motion might also be understood on different levels, so to say, with regard to the changeable or the unchangeable. So there are a lot of different, we can understand this why or what a cause is in many, many different ways in Aristotle. So physics and metaphysics are continuous on this point. However, whereas we in the physics were after the principles or causes then of change, when we come to metaphysics, we are asking for the causes or principles of things in their, let's say, mere property of being. So this is quoted on page 7 to note 18 in the article. Quote, we are seeking the principles and the causes of the things that are, and obviously of things qua being, end quote. So a difference here in the metaphysics compared to the physics is that he's seeking for principles of things rather than change. But otherwise, there is a parallelism between physics and metaphysics. The difference, though, is that we here go beyond physics in terms of subject area, as well as in the sense that we go beyond the physical realm of change. This is on page 7 to note 19. Quote, but if there is something which is eternal and immovable and separable, clearly the knowledge of it belongs to a theoretical science, not, however, to natural science, for natural science deals with movable things, nor to mathematics, but to a science prior to both, end quote. And here then we also come to the divine in Aristotle's understanding of this, and this is quoted on page 7 to note 21. Quote, there must then be 3 theoretical philosophies, mathematics, natural science, and theology. Since it is obvious that if the divine is present anywhere, it is present in things of this sort. And the highest science must deal with the highest genus, so that the theoretical sciences are superior to the other sciences, and this to the other theoretical sciences, end quote. He also has a quite, I think, interesting note on the status of natural science, if there were no such thing as the supernatural, and this is on page 8 to note 23 in your articles. Quote, we answer that if there is no substance other than those which are formed by nature, natural science will be the first science. But if there is an immovable substance, the science of this must be prior and must be first philosophy, and universal in this way, because it is first, end quote. So I think that's an interesting analysis of how you can come to a kind of scientism, or think that how a certain metaphysical view or ontology that there is nothing else but the natural world also leads to an understanding of the ordering of the sciences, then that natural science is kind of the overarching one. Might be obvious, but I still think it's neat that Aristotle already kind of points that out so clearly. So through an analysis of change and an explanation of change, Aristotle has come to that which is unchangeable, and in the end, then God. Now, I won't go into the explication of how life in general and human life in particular fits into this scheme, but the above suffices to show that the absolute being does not come in as someone who then intentionally directs the physical world. God is thought, but he's thought only of himself, as I mentioned on page 10, note 27. But God is rather that toward which everything is ultimately, let's say, drawn on the actuality potentiality analysis of change and of the principles of change then, and then also of immovable things, which I haven't gone into so much. So the important point here is that God does not come in as the one who intends things for the things in the world, but rather there is finality that comes out of an analysis of nature, and in the end you come through that to the highest being and comes in as like pure act toward which all is directed, but not through this having some intention with the things in the world. I mean, just to show that this is not a straw man, I have it on page 6, note 16, where there is this example of how Aristotle's understanding of it is interpreted in terms of this external ends, let's say, or things external to things. Right, so much for Aristotle. Continue with Buridan then. As you see, I don't take them chronologically, but I take what I take to be the more clear-cut solutions or clear-cut lines here as the first and second example, and then the kind of mixed example as the last one, Averroes. So Buridan, that you find treated from page 10. With him, we of course enter a very different mental world from that of Aristotle. So, for example, although Buridan famously never left the arts faculty, his philosophy was nonetheless influenced and informed by certain theological concerns that were hot topics at his time. More specifically, for example, the doctrine of transubstantiation required a certain degree of independence of the accidental forms from the substance. And I'll come to why this is important here. And this drew thinkers toward what might be called a substantialization of accidental forms. As one example of secondary literature that points this out, I have a quote from the great scholar Paul Bakker, who writes on Buridan's view, and you find this quotation on page 10 to 11 to note 31. So, quote, in contrast to the Aristotelian conception of the ontological status of accidental being, Buridan offers a different theory by taking into account the point of view of the faith. Referring explicitly to the subsistence of the Eucharistic accidents, sine subjecto, he takes this point of departure in affirmation of God's power to separate accidents from their substances. From this, he deduces that whiteness, in order to exist on its own, per se, must be a real being, and hence that it possesses the status of a being not only while existing separately from a substance, but also while inhering in a substance, end quote. This understanding then of the status of accidental forms in Buridan, summarized, it should be noted by Bakker above, is combined with a clear distinction between that which is on the one hand from that which is not on the other. So I'm into an argumentation here for trying to argue for Buridan's boolean metaphysics, 0 or 1, is or is not. Quote, the second conclusion, and this is you find on page 11, quote, the second conclusion is that prime matter is a being in act, not only in potency, because to be in potency only is not to be, but to be possible. But prime matter not only can be, but is, as was said, end quote. So we have here that it can't only be like potency, because potency is nothing. It just means that it possibly can be. In order to account for anything, then, a thing must be actual. Quote, that which is nothing is the cause of nothing, end quote. You find this quotation on page 11. So combining the understanding of actuality and potentiality with the nature of accidental forms, one can see how change is not so much than the actualization of a potentiality, as it is then in Aristotle, as it is the replacement of one form with another, simply, in substantial as well as in accidental change. These two changes, then, the accidental and substantial, are becoming very similar in its metaphysical structure, let's say. And on pages 11 to 12, you find a longer quotation from Calvin Normor that goes more into detail regarding this difference. I won't go into that. This then is also connected to Buridan's understanding of modalities and also of final causation, because for Buridan, modalities and final causation cannot be understood otherwise than in connection to a rational agent. A rational agent with free will, one might add. As Henrik Åkerlund then has written, and you find this quotation on page 12 to note 37, quote, obviously nothing in nature acts for the sake of the good other than humans. Ends are just intentions of rational agents, end quote. This is primarily what is needed here, that Buridan then has a clear intentionalist understanding of finality. So he does not reject final causation, but it is explicitly connected to intentionality. And here you have a quotation on pages 13 to 14, to note 43, quote, the end in the first intention, prima intenzione, is that which is first in the order of being, goodness, and perfection. It is that for which, or for the sake of which, something or someone acts. For example, it can be the man for whom the house is constructed. If we consider the whole universe, it is God who is in this sense the end of everything, end quote. I have to insert a reference there that I forgot. Within nature, though, other causes are at play, primarily formal and efficient causation. And here's a quote on page 14 to note 45. Quote, but as far as natural things are concerned, I believe that a swallow mating, nesting, and laying eggs does not cognize any more when it produces chicks than a tree does when it produces branches and flowers. Nor do the mating, nesting, and egg-laying activities of the swallow depend for their being and order on those chicks. Rather, the converse is true, end quote. So that was briefly on Buridan, where I rely quite a lot on secondary literature, as you see, but I would say that it's quite unanimous. Last then, we have Averroes, and I mean, he's the most difficult one, I guess, to kind of spell out an unequivocal position from, because he has these commentaries on Aristotle, and there's this discussion what's Averroes' view and what is merely an explication of Aristotle. So it's hard to kind of exactly pinpoint down what his exact view is, but I would say it's still obvious that he combines these two views as his own. On the one hand, that you have an intentionalist understanding of finality at bottom, that God directs everything by having an intention with the world that he creates, and also that this world internally is structured in accordance with the structure of act and potency. So here are some quotations then where we can see that he affirms these two views, basically. So you find it on page 16, and these are 3 quotes to notes 49 to 51. First then, quote, "For the philosophers believe that there are 4 causes, agent, matter, form, and the end," end quote. So there you see, takes over basically the Aristotelian scheme. And then the next quote, quote, his, that is Al-Ghazali's, that is arguing against, assertion that not every cause is called an agent is true, but his argument that the inanimate is not called an agent is false. For the denial that the inanimate exhibits acts excludes only the rational and voluntary act, not act absolutely. For we find that certain inanimate things have powers to actualize things like themselves. For example, fire, which changes anything warm and dry into another fire like itself through converting it from what it has in potency, that is the thing that is put on fire, from what it has in potency into actuality, end quote. So that's a clear act potency scheme understanding of causation. And the last quote, quote, "When one observes the sublunary world, one finds that what is called living and knowing moves on its own account in well-defined movements towards well-defined ends and well-defined acts from which new well-defined acts rise," end quote. So we can here see how Averroes affirms that there are 4 causes, and in accordance with Aristotle, that there is true agency in the world against a more occasionalist understanding of causation found in Al-Ghazali, and that movement towards certain ends takes place within this sublunary world itself. Actually, precisely that there is real causation within the sublunary world is important to stress against Al-Ghazali, among other things, because otherwise there would be no true knowledge of things. So one argument against their not being any causation in the world is that if there is no true causation, we would not have any true knowledge of things, because knowledge we gain then of the world, we gain through our sensory experience, and sensory experience has to do with something outside of us causing something in our sensory powers. And then from there on, we go up to have knowledge of things. However, if there were no such connection, this knowledge would have to be infused in some other way. So we would not have that kind of true knowledge of the world. Without having to go into Averroes' cosmology, though, ultimately all the causes, and also the end, of course, comes from God's commandments and intentions, as you can see on the long quote on pages 18 to 19 to note 58. Quote, "It also becomes clear from the fact that all the spheres have the daily circular movement, although besides this movement they have, as the philosophers have ascertained, their own special movements, that he who commands this movement must be the first principle, that is God, and that he commands the other principles to order the other movements to the other spheres. Through this, heaven and earth are ruled as a state is ruled by the commands of the supreme monarch, which, however, are transmitted to all classes of the population by the men he has appointed for this purpose in the different affairs of the state. As it says in the Quran, and he inspires every heaven with its bidding. This heavenly injunction and this obedience are the prototypes of the injunction and obedience imposed on man because he is a rational animal," end quote. That's the point. Averroes combines an act potency scheme with a certain degree of autonomy of the causes in the world with a framework where the ends, all ends, must ultimately come from a divine command or intention. So just let me read then the conclusion. Whereas Aristotle understands finality in a non-intentionalist way as the actualization of a potentiality, And whereas for Buridan, finality only enters the picture by the operation of a rational agent, for Averroes, the act-potency scheme used in order to explicate the workings of especially the sublunar world and its ends is combined with an intentionalist understanding of finality, basically, where the whole order of the world is ultimately dependent on the intentions and commands of God. And then on page 20, you have the four-fielder set up. In the later Latin Middle Ages, a purely Aristotelian conception of finality was not really accessible. Thus, what we have are understandings of the question that also later write Buridanian or Averroist expressions and solutions, in the sense of combining a basically intentionalist understanding with a dynamic metaphysics, where ends can also be understood to be inherent in nature, or a boolean metaphysics, where the ends tend to be understood as being extrinsic to things in the world. The reason for setting up this scheme, though, has not been so much to give an interpretation of the above thinkers, and here you come to the part where this is supposed to be a part of a book, but rather to have a background scheme on which to treat thinkers dealing with finality in the later Middle Ages. As will be seen, these thinkers very much do this in dialogue with the above thinkers and others, and so hopefully the above treatment will also serve as a background for understanding these discussions in this way also. End quote. Thank you for your attention.